trust Ángel, who knows this is the future and has so much to say about it.
Hi again.
Great work. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about decentralization. And I'm going to talk about decentralization from two different angles as something that in itself is open. I'm going to talk about decentralization as a model that can help us to understand the world around us across any domain, and also decentralization as the reason which explains the activities of what's happening in commerce, what's happening with the relationship between consumers, individuals, and brands. So those two horizons that need each other, the idea of decentralization as a way to look around you and feel what's happening across anything that touches on every domain, and it changes the relationship between anything that's big and small. And the first objective I have by doing that is for us to gain and acquire a particular attitude. So when we think more specifically on how decentralization is affecting our domain, our field, search and discovery platforms, the arena where we operate, we can tackle that with that different open mechanic of thinking, which I believe can create incredible possibilities for us. Now, understanding truly decentralization is very difficult. And it's what I'm longing for here today. And I don't have a slide, so I require your imagination here. And it is very difficult by default, because the very exercise of understanding is a linear, centralized process, while the very nature of that which we try to understand and we want to flow in it is the whole concept of decentralization, which is the antithesis of linearity. It is openness, it is fragmentation, it's plurality. And starting with decentralization as a way to understand the world around us, what's happening, you may be sharing this feeling. I certainly have this feeling, and it's very exciting, and I take it very positively, that a feeling as if we're starting a new era, and I speak beyond COVID, beyond Donald Trump, a feeling as it's something, of course, it is a process, it's not an event, but as something is unfolding. And when you pay attention and try to reveal what is happening in terms of fragmentation, in terms of decentralization, it is very exciting, because you can grasp, talking about color, a particular color palette. So, what do I mean by the world around us and how decentralization affects it? Look at every domain that has been permeated by the internet. Think of entertainment industry. Think of education. Think of the other side of that coin, jobs. Think of, even sports. Think of even politics or beliefs, of course, with the geospatial social considerations of that. But across all these domains, the relationship between the ones who create, the ones who produce, and the ones who consume is changed. And that relationship has and holds a different construct. And that construct is explained by a fragmentation, iteration by iteration. The offer is made smaller and more identitarian, and the demand is also expressed in more specific, unique ways. Now, coming back to entertainment, for example, in music, you can see from the 50s to now the progression, and how it has experienced an incredible proliferation of unique identities designed for very specific communities and tribes. Jose Rueje can testify this. his passion for music. If you look at video games, Bertrand was commenting, I don't have any video game account, but if you look at video games, you also sense this proliferation. When you look, of course, at film and television production, you sense this proliferation that you've seen only in the last 10 years. Yeah. So across all these domains, the demand keeps fragmenting and keeps expressing itself in much more niche, unique forms, and the offer keeps fragmenting and gives way to very specific, very small, yet very strong brands and identities. And this is in business, creating also very interesting phenomena. Big brands, big companies, shall I say, big makers are giving way to much more smaller, specific, relevant brands. If you look even to traditional industries, like for example, automotive, Pablo, you may agree with this. At the beginning of the 20th century, you had hundreds of different brands of car makers. And at the end of the very same century, you just had a handful, I think it was 5 or 6. However, what has happened is that the extreme proliferation of very unique brands within the makers and models within the brands. When you look across, many of the big companies who are doing really well nowadays, companies in the consumer packaged goods, think of Unilever, think of Procter & Gamble, think of PepsiCo. All these companies, is fascinating when you look into them and you realize that they are made of very small, unique brands. In Unilever, you know this very well, Bo. They are the makers of Dove in Spanish, and also the makers of Lynx, Axe in Spanish, targeting such opposite specific audiences. So the way they serve this decentralization and this proliferation and this fragmentation, this multiplicity of demand and offer is by they themselves acquiring different, very specific identities. And what they have in common, the companies that are doing really well through this, is that they have understood this and they continue to buy different brands. You can see this in the beer making, in the health sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, but it never ceases to amaze me that there are some of the companies that still remain and resist this decentralization. You think of the big personified brands. Think of Paul Smith. Think of Ralph Lauren. Think of Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger. Those brands are going through a very difficult time. They're struggling to survive. And what these brands that are going through a difficult time have in common is that they are these big labels, personified brands that target the market with one single identity. Well, now not everyone wants to be Ralph Lauren or Paul Smith, and these companies struggle with this. Some notable exceptions on that group, like Gucci, that they have decided to shift their keeping the label but shifting their audience. I don't know how many times you could do that. The bottom line here is that some leaders on some of these domains understand this multiplicity, understands this plurality, and this openness and this fragmentation that with each iteration is elevating the consumer, from a user to a consumer, from a consumer to a unique individual whose freedoms are respected, and hence the very notion of seeking trustworthiness. With each iteration, these brands that are trying to become relevant, they try to, and they are aspiring to become companions of each of these companies, So why am I saying all this? Because as I said, some companies, some individuals in positions of leadership struggle to grasp the very notion of decentralization. And they struggle to grasp it because, as I said at the beginning, the very exercise of trying to see something and trying to think of something is an exercise that follows linearity and causality, and you try to apply a centralized mindset to understand something that otherwise is decentralized. You're trying to have a guide, to seek guidelines, to understand something that doesn't have guidelines anymore. You try to look for absolutes, where there are truths or falsehoods, to understand something that doesn't have such a thing. Multiple answers are true or false. So to kind of tune your mind into this openness of decentralization and multiplicities, it takes a very interesting, fragmented, conscious effort, you know. And I want us in empathy to speak that language. You know, I want us, because once you tune into the space of decentralization, and I think Matt Hart makes some of these remarks in his content later that we have. Once you tune your mind to an open decentralization, just decentralized open thinking and attitude, anything is possible. Anything is possible. And I'm going to give you some examples that now map into what we do at Empathy. Basically, you know, curiously or paradoxically, when you look at our world, you know, the field where we are, you know, this is very simple to see. We have consumers and we have brands, and there is a space in between. And in that space in between is where we focus our value, you know, in that relationship. Now, decentralization has changed that relationship. That relationship is opening. That relationship with each iteration is elevating the consumer to higher qualities, seeing the consumer as a user who makes decisions in predictable and understandable ways. It seems inadequate, quantitatively and qualitatively. It is almost ethically inadequate. So the user is elevated. The brands considers the user as something, someone, as opposed to something, as a subject, as opposed to an object. And in that consideration of the user as an individual with all this that this entitles, the brand is trying and seeking desperately to be more relevant. Now, if you look, as I said, to the e-commerce platforms and the search and discovery platforms and the customer data platforms and the experience platforms and analytics platforms and all these platforms and solutions, which is the mental space where our targets and prospects and people we try to be relevant to, is where they are and how they think about empathy in comparison to those solutions. When you go into that arena, you realize that it's highly centralized. You know, across any of these solutions that any of these companies try to incorporate, beneath there are centralized architectures. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that beneath all these platforms, they have, all of them, event systems. Event systems that capture data, take this data, and this data travels into central state, and there persists, there is controlled, and then is modeled, and then it serves two purposes, and is justified on two counts. Number one is used for analytics and reporting across all those different platforms. And number two is used for intelligence or automation. So when you look to any platform that is happening in the field of value within consumers and brands, they all have this new process to provide intelligence and to provide analytics whose nutrients are the events that are captured from people's interaction and the different digital channels. Now, here's where it comes to fundamental contradiction. There is distance. There is distance from where I am, from where you are, when you open Netflix, and what you see is shaped by what you've done before. There is distance from where you are when you open your Deliveroo or your Glovo app, and what you see is shaped by what you've done before. But that logic is happening somewhere else. Somewhere else, by that I mean in some customer data platform, on some intelligence platform of whatever kind. Now, the problem with distance is that per se, in its very nature, acts against trust, you know, by virtue of its factual nature. And distance doesn't help. Now, some of these companies you see, even in analytics platforms like Google, have started to entertain the idea of playing a fair data game, playing fair data play. And what do I mean by a fair data play? They start to try and offer explainability, as we have constitutionally done in empathy. They try to offer controls and transparency. They try to offer, even in the case of Google Analytics, portability. But all these actions that try to make up these platforms as being trustworthy are not enough, because fundamentally underneath lies this centralized way of thinking of information processing and information architectures, which does not agree to the dynamic that explains the activities of commerce. And it seems contradictory to the very notion of elevating the user to be a human being. And I explain this in just a second. Unless these companies and these platforms surrender the responsibilities of data control, i.e. persistence, these platforms cannot deliver a trustworthy experience. The whole concept of decentralization, in essence, is to give control to different nodes on a plane, on space. So that exercise of control that is resolved within a central state in a customer data platform, for example, it acts against that very concept. Now, to give you a specific example which should help, think of customer data platforms. Customer data platforms are trying to build what they call a 360 degrees view of the customer, which is inviable because the reality of the customer, when you elevate them as an individual, is made of all these other aspects that happen outside the silo of your brand. So customer data platforms with that model of collecting these silos in usage and benefit of the brand cannot be trusted unless they surrender the control of the data into and handing this important responsibility into the sphere of the consumer. That trust cannot be achieved. This is a very important consideration. There are two roles that right now these platforms exercise: the role of the controller of the data and the role of the processor of the data. Think of it as persistence and modeling, execution. Now, the role of the controller of the data shall travel and be allocated there where the data is systematically created, there where the data is utilized, which also in terms of information architecture makes all sense of the world. So that logic is the way you execute a notion of decentralization across these platforms. Now, if you look at the way we do things in empathy, we've been, I believe, smart about this, because the way we do, for example, the discovery wall, out of everything that we do in empathy, across all the ampliance and capabilities that we hold, the discovery wall is the most personalized experience you can have because it profiles the consumer. But how did we resolve the discovery wall? Well, we used the local first approach. And that was no accident, one like to think. And the way we place that logic in the device of the consumer means that the consumer becomes the controller of those assets. And the brand limits their responsibility to that of the processor. That is to resolve and instrument decentralization in an advanced information system platform. So this unlocks many other possibilities, as I said, when we start to think in terms of decentralization and try to map what's happening and what explains what's taking place in the world around us to the way we create value in that relationship between consumers and brands, between demand and offer. Think of the following case. If decentralization is executed in the world of a commerce platform, inevitably control of profiling data is allocated there where its consumer or its household is. And that responsibility is relieved from the brand. Now, what does this represent? I call this the omni, as in the many, brand experience. Not a name that I'm a fan of, but I'm hoping that it can be understood by it. The omni brand experience means that I can connect what's happening around me in the relationship that I have with one brand, with the relationship I have with another brand, with the relationship I have with another brand. Now, coming back to opening your app that you use to deliver or order your delivery food. What you see is shaped by your data. If that which you see is shaped by data, which is within your radar, then why not can that interplay with the entertainment app? The entertainment app then could suggest content to accompany your choice of food, or vice versa. Now we can scale this idea into many other domains, from calendars, from bank data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that idea that we place the value and the exercise of surveillance capital, surveillance on the users and the visits and the sessions, rather than serving the benefit of a brand that aspires to become a companion of the consumer, all that event data, when it comes to serve and deliver a benefit, is delivered within the radar and the sphere of privacy of each consumer, and therefore unlocks this combination of omni-brand experiences. So if we try to open to this plural, fragmented interpretation of the world of anything that has been permeated by the internet, that cannot exist without the internet, and we breathe this notion of decentralization, this notion of elevating the consumers to human beings, which is exactly what we are about. And we poured this into a world as a search and discovery platform. We put aside a lot of centralized mechanics of thinking, and we open up to the idea of giving more control and allocating control of providing to each consumer, which is, for example, the way we shaping motive shop, inevitably. I struggle to see the world of commerce platforms, experience platforms, even analytics or customer data platforms for sure, how much they can evolve, how much they can sophisticate without breaking with this centralized model. In the same way, I see an incredible potential for us in the long term if we deliver our value, our thinking, our creativity, the way we conceive our capabilities, the way surely we evolve them with this mindset, which is what it means to move from trust as a theory to trust as a fact, as an action. And you can establish the parallelism to the way we dealt with experiences. We, from the early beginning, we thought that experiences needed to be articulated. Experiences needed to be executed. You cannot deliver an experience unless you incorporate within the sphere of digital product its perceptual elements. That is the UI. This is why we created the UI product for search. This is why we created a play product that elicits and seeks to elicit certain emotional responses and negotiate the way these products are perceived. So we thought, everybody's talking about experiences, but we are not here to talk about them. We're here to act on them. The same principle applies here to trust. Trust is now the agenda. You're going to hear it from everyone. But there's a difference between speaking, saying, and actually doing something. And this is what we're doing with trust in our solutions, capabilities, and products, to think and act with distributed architectures, decentralized, which is a step further, architectures that place the control and act on delivering that to the user, who we consider no less than a human being. So with that, my dearest Bo, I'm sorry that I have taken 4 minutes, but I didn't count to start a few moments later. I'm sure we'll be able to manage that. Thank you so much.